In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the central pathways that transmits sensory information within the spinal cord and up towards the brain. And we start at the lowest level in the central pathway, and that is the spinal cord. And so what we're looking at here on this slide are cross sections at any particular level of the spinal cord and how that sensory information is transmitted. Now we see here the extensive labeling indicates that there are unique regions that are somewhat compartmentalized in terms of how the spinal cord is structurally organized. And so what we see here on the left-hand side, clearly we have what's called the white matter and the gray matter to begin our distinction. And within the gray matter, there are two distinctive, what are called horns. A horn on the dorsal side called the dorsal horn, and a horn on the ventral side referred to as the ventral horn. And what we see here is in this particular level of the spinal cord is that the ventral horn is considerably larger than the dorsal horn. And the ventral horn typically contains large neurons, and this is where many of those alpha motor neurons in terms of the cell bodies reside. And there are neurons in the dorsal horn, but these are smaller neurons that typically serve as interneurons. If we take a look at the bottom right-hand corner here, we see that in this cross section that we have different areas of the white matter, and the white matter is unique in that it is devoid of the cell bodies in terms of the volume of cell bodies of neurons that we see in the gray matter. And the areas on the dorsal side of the spinal cord in the white matter contain ascending axons only. So these are axons that are transmitting information upwards towards in the direction of the brainstem. In the lateral, what are called the lateral and ventral regions of the white matter, also referred to as columns, these areas contain both ascending and descending axons. So axons that transmit sensory information up to the brain are located in the dorsal white matter as well as in the lateral and ventral white matter, and the axons that transmit information from the brain, which are the motor axons towards the lower levels, are contained in the ventral and lateral columns. And the information here we see on this top left-hand portion of our lower image indicates that we have information coming in from the body's surface, and that information is integrated with interneurons, in some cases directly with motor neurons from muscle receptors, but that information also is simultaneously transmitted upwards towards the brainstem. So when we take a look at the white matter, the dorsal columns, as illustrated by these two unique areas, contain ascending axons only. The lateral columns outlined here on the bottom right-hand corner contain both ascending and descending axons, remembering that ascending is transmitting sensory information, descending is transmitting motor information. And the descending axons are transmitting motor information through upper motor neurons as well as interacting with interneurons. The ventral columns contain descending axons that will terminate onto motor neurons that affect axial and postural muscles. In terms of the ascending neurons in the ventral columns, these are typically neurons that transmit information regarding pain and temperature. If we take a more global look at the spinal cord in terms of spinal cord structure, we see that at different levels of the spinal cord, from the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral levels in these cross sections, we see that the area taken up by the gray matter does change considerably depending upon that level. For instance, at the sacral level, so if we go at the very bottom here, we see we have in this illustration sacral level number 3 of the spinal cord and sacral level 4. We don't see as much white matter, but we see a very large area devoted to the gray matter. So we have relatively less axons in at the lower levels. We still have axons, but not as many as we see with the upper levels. The cervical levels, in contrast, and we'll take a look at that here with C1, C4, and C7 and C8, we see a much greater region of the spinal cord is dedicated to the white matter. So the cervical levels contain many axons and much more white matter. The descending axons coming from higher levels, the brains, most of those axons will terminate at the cervical levels, but those axons do continue to transmit information to the lowest levels of the sacrum. In areas where we see relatively larger ventral horns, these are spinal levels that house motor neurons that innervate the arms and legs. So if we take a look at the cervical levels, for example, we see that the ventral horns take up more space than the dorsal horns. And that's considerably seen at C4 and C7, 8. But when you move to the thoracic levels, you don't see those large ventral areas comparably to the dorsal region of the gray matter. And that pattern reverses once again, not as profound as we saw with the cervical levels, but at the lumbar level, we start to see an expansion of those ventral horns once again. So the expanded ventral horns reflect that there are more cell bodies of those motor neurons, and that makes sense because there's a need to innervate more muscle cells that are located in the periphery with respect to the arms and the legs, and that reflects those larger ventral horns. In terms of larger dorsal horns, the larger dorsal horn reflects a greater density of sensory receptors. Remember, the dorsal horns do contain cell bodies, mostly of the cell bodies of interneurons, but expanded dorsal horns indicates that there are more sensory receptors bringing information into the gray matter, and that's a reflection that more fibers are being sent to the spinal cord, and that's reflected in what are called enlargements. And there are two enlargements in the spinal cord. There's the cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargement, and we see that in terms of the overall spinal cord tissue, where it's laterally expanded at those two regions, reflecting the increased traffic, if you will, of information coming in and information going out, reflecting more neurons. So the ascending axons that transmits information up to the brain is somewhat compartmentalized, and the distribution is maintained with respect to what's called somatotopy. So somatotopy is a term that refers to a compartmentalized or isolated region within the central nervous system that is dedicated to a particular part of the body, and that's most evident in the cerebral cortex, but that is also maintained in the spinal cord. So this starts in the sacral region, and axons tend to move into pathways that are more medial in the dorsal columns. And so when we talk about medial, we're talking about a location close to the midline in this cross section. And as we move from the sacral up towards the cervical region, there's a progressive merging of axons from medial to the lateral portion. The two regions of the dorsal columns, as you can see here, are the grasso-fascicle and accuneate fascicle, and these contain neurons, particularly the axon portions, that are clustered medially, as you can see in this picture. And these contain mostly fibers from the lower extremities, and that's where that information is transmitted to higher levels. And it terminates in a cluster of neurons up towards the brain. The more laterally positioned cuneate fascicle uh, does contain more fibers from the upper body, and it terminates in a similar region in the brain, which refers to the nucleus or the cluster of cell bodies where we have synaptic connections. Not all of the neurons that ascend synaptically connect necessarily here. It depends upon the origin of those sensory neurons. The transmission of this sensory information up to the brain will eventually, for the most part, not all neurons, but most of the neurons will decussate, which is a term that refers to the transmission to the contralateral side of the central nervous system. And so what we see here, we'll start here at the very bottom, where here we have, it's a small picture, but here we have a person's thumb touching an external surface, activating sensory receptors in the skin. And that information comes in, we see the dorsal root ganglion that houses the cell bodies for those sensory neurons. And that information, in addition to interacting with interneurons at the spinal level, will also send a very long branch up to the medulla in the brainstem region, where it will synapse onto neurons that will decussate. So the synaptic connection will see an axon that will transmit to the opposite side or contralateral side of the medulla and will continue upward through the midbrain where we have another synaptic connection at the thalamus, and then at the thalamus, the what's called a third order sensory neuron will terminate at specific regions in the cerebral cortex. And this pathway is summarized as what's called the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, or DCML. And so the medial lemniscus are made up of long fiber bundles from the medulla in the brainstem, as illustrated in this picture, that will synapse at the level of the thalamus. And the thalamus is a portion of the brain that serves essentially as a relay station. So we have many synaptic connections, particularly in what's called the VP nucleus. So the nucleus here refers to a cluster of cell body neurons in the thalamus that will eventually communicate that sensory information to the cerebral cortex, where it's arranged somatotopically. So as you can see here at the top right-hand corner, there are unique portions of the cerebral cortex that receives information regarding the trunk, the leg, the toe, so on and so forth. And that's the somatotopic organization of the cerebral cortex. So this ends our first video on part 3 of the somatosensory system.